Good morning, Gathering class. It's great to be with you this morning. I'm Pastor Ryan here, and I have a couple updates for you guys. Sorry this is getting out to you so late, this teaching and whatnot. I have been sick all week. I know I don't look it, but yeah, it's been a tough week. I actually had a COVID test yesterday. I am feeling much better right now, which is only the grace of God, which is awesome. I don't think I have COVID, but we'll see. I was with a dear friend last week, and after her father died, and she was tested positive for COVID yesterday. So who knows? Pray for me, pray for my wife that I don't have it, that she doesn't get it if I do have it, and that God's provision will be made clear to us. And ultimately, at the end of the day, God's in control. So whatever happens, we'll be okay. But again, sorry for the delay in getting this to you. We like to have these videos out, recorded and done by Tuesday so that we can send the email out by Wednesday. But been sick, and so I just appreciate the grace. I'm at home, as you can see, not in the office, and so I got a couple dogs around here. My wife's at the office, and so she, because she's not here, the dogs might bark, and just forgive them for that. They're adorable, so just think of really cute dogs if they're barking. All that said, it's time to jump back into Genesis. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and we're going to get into Genesis. So again, welcome to the gathering. This is a ministry of Scottsdale Bible Church. If you're joining us for the first time, or if you're new to the gathering, welcome. Normally, we have a much prettier presenter. His name is Bill Epley, Dr. Bill Epley. I've known him my entire life, and he is an incredible teacher, a beautiful man, just in his heart and his faith. His wife, Ann, has taken great care of me and my wife since we moved to Scottsdale Bible Church to be a pastor. And so if you know Bill, send him a thanks for allowing Pastor Bob Drew and myself to host this summer and to teach this summer. Also want to shout out to Judd, who's the class leader, and to Bill Bartlett, who's just a dear friend and another class leader for the gathering. Y'all have been so gracious to me and to Bob in this season. So with that, I am excited to get going with Genesis. So this summer, we're covering Genesis 16 to 50. And if you were here last summer, you remember that Bob and I covered Genesis 1 to 15. And so we have a lot of ground to cover this summer. It's many more chapters, and yet it's much more story-driven, much more narrative. And so we can cover a lot more ground because there's larger swaths per story. So here's Bob and me. We are your two pastors this summer. Bob is our SBC Shea campus groups pastor, and I am our SBC Shea campus associate pastor in the venue. And we both went to TEDS. We're TEDS trained. And so if you have questions about Trinity, let me know. All that said, moving on. So our 12-week theme is God's promise. Remember, God made a covenant with Abraham in chapter 15, and his promise was to protect him and his family, to make him a great nation, and to flourish Abraham and his people. And so what we're seeing is that this is God's promise, faith through families. God is giving faith and using faith through the family line of Abraham to bring about the Savior, Jesus Christ, into the world. But that's going to be in 1,500 years, 2,000 years from Abraham. So we're still a long way off from Jesus. And at this point, this is a very new, a very nascent faith that they have, a faith that God is Yahweh, that he will be their God and he will protect them, and that he will give them a nation and a land. Other than that, there's not a whole lot that worship of Yahweh looks like, other than fidelity and fealty to him through faith. So Genesis 20 through 21, Abraham is imperfect, and yet he is faithful. That's what we're covering today, is Genesis 20 through 21, Abraham being imperfect and yet being faithful. I have just noticed that for some reason I can't see my notes as we go through this. So I'm going to pause our recording briefly Um, and let's see here. How can I do that? Stop share, pause recording. I'll be right back with you. Okay, we're back. For you, that was probably no time at all. For me, that was about 5-10 minutes trying to get everything in order for my screens. I have my other screen down here, so if you see me doing this, I'm reading my notes, not avoiding you guys. But with all that said, I apologize for the delay. Let us get going. And share my screen. Here we go. Technology for the win. Okay. We're back. Okay, so Genesis 20 through 21, Abraham, imperfect and yet faithful. So here's our outline for the morning, for our teaching time today, because this is pretty important. We're going to have this 4 stories that really happen in order, and it's kind of a sandwich construction. If you can see that, it's an Abimelech sandwich. It's going to have Abimelech, then Isaac, and then Hagar and Ishmael, and then Abimelech again to end our time. And these 2 bookmarks of Abimelech are really showing and showcasing Abraham and showing who Abraham is, who he's continuing to be, how he's developing, and how God is faithful in spite of Abraham's sin, in spite of his faithlessness at times. And so we're gonna see this Abimelech character come up now in 20, and then in 21, and then in, I think, 24 we'll see him, and then you see him again in Judges. This guy doesn't live for a couple hundreds of years. He actually, it's a title most likely. So the scholars believe that Abimelech, it means this is what they believe. This is actually what it means. It means the father is king. Av or Ab is the Hebrew word for father, and then Melech is the word for king. So father is king. Now, in the Gerites or the Philistines, what we can know is that it probably was the divine name of the throne, or the kingly name given to those who sat on the throne, or it was a family name through a lineage. And so we're going to see this father king figure from Gerar come up and talk with Abraham. And it's going to get messy, as it always does with Abraham and other foreign kings. But Abimelech is going to be very important for us today. And then, of course, we finally have the birth of the promised son, Isaac. And then we're going to have a conflict between Isaac and Ishmael, between Sarah and Hagar. And so we're going to have then a Hagar and Ishmael story. And then we're going to end again with Abimelech. But with all of that said, I'm going to pray for us, and then we can get going. But would you pray with me? Lord Jesus, we thank you for this time where we can get into your word. Lord, I just, after the week I've had of feeling weak and feeble and tired and coughing and, Lord, shortness of breath and all of this other symptoms I've had, Lord, I've been afraid this week. My wife's been afraid this week, and I've been tired this week. And yet, God, you are faithful in spite of my inability. And so, Lord, I pray that you would just teach through me today. Speak the words that you want spoken. Because, God, I don't have a whole lot to give right now, and yet you always have a lot to give, Father. So, God, teach your people. Teach me through this. Spirit, I pray that you would illuminate whatever you want us to understand from this, that you would teach us who Jesus is, teach us who the Father is, teach us who you are, and teach us how we fit into that equation. But God, we are excited to come before you to learn and to hear from your word. And it's in your name that we pray, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so before we hop into Genesis 20, there's a key passage that we need to understand. And it's all the way back in Genesis 12, verse 3. So this is the first time that God and Abram meet. This is before the Great Covenant. This is before circumcision. This is before all the other dealings that God has with Abram. And yet, this is the first promise that God gives to him. And so we're kind of coming in the middle of this, but it talks about land and whatnot, and how I'm going to give you this land to your people. And then Yahweh says, and I will make of you, Abraham, or Abram at the time, a great nation. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, this is important because verse 3 is going to come into play in 2 seconds for us. Because if we remember back when Abraham was in Egypt with Sarah, Abraham said that Sarah was his sister and allowed Sarah to be taken into Pharaoh's harem. And that was Abraham being faithless. That was him not trusting God saying, "And him who dishonors you, I will curse." Abraham said, "I will take this into my own hands." And we're about to see that happen once again. And so that's why I want this to be our backdrop for this morning. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's Abraham's promise. And we're going to see him not believe that once again, and yet God be faithful in spite of all of that. So here we go. Genesis chapter 20, verses 1-3. It says, "From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, 'She is my sister.' And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, 'Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife.'" I mean, right out of the gate, we're already back in Egypt, it feels like. Now, we're not in Egypt. This is a new place, a new king, a new people. And yet Abraham is sojourning in Gerar. And what happens? It says, "She is my sister." And that's kind of the only context we're given. And yet in Genesis 12, 10-16, also right after our key text, where God promises Abraham to curse those who dishonor him, he's in Egypt. And it says, "Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there." And when he gets there, they ask about his wife, Sarai, who is exceedingly beautiful. And he says that she's his sister because he didn't want to be killed. He didn't want to be put in prison, or to be shamed, or to be taken of his money or anything like that. He was afraid of Egypt, and so he allowed Sarah to get taken. And here, once again, he says the exact same thing. And so that's why there's not a whole lot of context here. It just says, "She is my sister," because we're going to just assume that it's the exact same situation as what happened in Egypt. And in Egypt, Pharaoh gave a bride price to Abraham for Sarai. And yet here, Abimelech just takes Sarah. He just comes in and takes her. We don't know if this is kidnapping or if this is a treaty marriage. You know how in the days of kings, you would marry off your daughter or your sister or some female relative of yours to a king, and that would create a treaty between the two of you. That's probably what this is. It's more of a treaty because Sarah is about 99 years old at this point. The way of women was not with her anymore, it says. And Sarah even said that she's dried up. She's pretty harsh on herself. And so we don't believe this is because Sarah was beautiful and Abimelech wanted her for himself. This isn't about lust. This is probably about power. This is probably about control and about alliances and treaties. But he comes and he takes Sarah. And God comes to him in the middle of the night in a dream. We don't know how long it's been. We don't know if it's immediately that night or if it's been several months or, probably not a year, because the promise to Abraham was already given that in a year you will have a son. And so this is in between that time where God says from a year from today, within the year, you will have Isaac. And Sarah will conceive. And so it's in between that timeline. We don't know if Sarah's pregnant yet. We don't know if she's not pregnant yet. So it's not a whole lot of time, but it's some amount of time that goes by before God comes to Abimelech. And he says, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman you have taken, for she is a man's wife." And what we see is that Abimelech is then terrified of this. He's terrified by what God says. And it says, "Now Abimelech had not approached her. He had not slept with her yet. He had not consummated the marriage, if you will, with Sarah. And so he said, 'Look, Lord, will you kill an innocent people?' He knows that this proclamation of death isn't just for him, but for his whole people. In the Mishnah, or in the Jewish rabbinic writings, it tells us most likely that Abimelech's people have been stricken with boils and with barrenness and some other diseases. And we don't know if that's true or not. That's rabbinic teaching and tradition. But what we know is that they were stricken with barrenness and some and deathly disease. And so he says, "Will you kill an innocent people?" Did he not himself say to me, "She is my sister"? And she herself said, "He is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this." This is Abimelech pleading his case to God in this dream, saying, I've done nothing wrong. I didn't know that she was married. I didn't know this was adultery. I didn't know that I was taking a married woman from a married man. I thought this was his sister and that she was that he was her brother. And then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart. And it was I who kept you from sinning against me by consummating the marriage. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours." This is a fascinating dream that Abimelech has. He's not one of God's people. He's not part of Abraham's family. And yet God is coming to Abimelech. And what we see is a dilemma. Is Abimelech going to listen and fear God? Or is he going to be unrighteous and not fear God and choose his own way? That's the great question we have here. God even says, "I know that you're not at fault here, Abimelech. I know that this isn't your fault that this happened. This happened because of lying. This happened because of deception. But in spite of that, you still need to give this man's wife back. Regardless of your innocence in the matter, you are still held responsible for this woman." And so Abimelech now has a choice to make. Is he going to repent, and even of something that he isn't really at fault for, and give Sarah back? Or is he going to keep her and fight against Abram and God? So we're going to keep going and look at this passage because it's fascinating what happens then, because Abimelech rises early in the morning. It says the very next morning he rises and he calls his servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? What did you see that you did this thing? So Abimelech immediately repents. He immediately follows God's command to return Sarah. He goes to his men, and they are all afraid of God. There is fear of the Lord among these men, regardless of the fact that they are not part of the covenant people. They're not in Abraham's family. They fear the Lord. And they come, and Abimelech accuses Abraham. And he says, "Why have you done this to me? You did this, Abraham. You knew what you were doing. You knew that this was false. You knew that she was your wife, and you knew and you calculated this, that you would be spared. What happened here?" And he goes, "What did you see? What was it around here that you saw that you did this thing? What caused this?" And the word "done" is repeated and repeated and repeated. What have you done to us? You have done to me these things, and you've done things that ought not to be done. What did, or what have you done? What did you see that you did this thing? It's constantly Abimelech putting it back to Abraham. You were wrong. You were wrong. You were wrong. Why? But he's pleading with him, and he's asking, what happened here? And so we have Abimelech acting righteously, and Abraham acting unrighteously. And if we go back to our key text, we remember that God promises to bless those who bless Abraham and to curse those who curse Abraham. And yet Abraham here acts without faith. He doesn't believe God, and so he takes matters into his own hands, and he deceives Abimelech, and then Abimelech calls him on it. So we have the man that is not part of the covenant being faithful, and the man who is part of the covenant being faithless. Once again, Abraham fails to live up to what God has promised him, and he doubts what God has promised him. So, Genesis 20, 11 to 13. Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. That's a powerful statement. He says, I didn't think there was any fear of God here. I didn't think you would do righteousness, and I thought you would be unrighteous, Abimelech. And yet what do we see happen is that Abimelech and all of his men act righteously, and they are afraid. Abraham misjudged terribly. So what we can see is that Abraham's not doing this because there is no fear of God and he judged rightly. It's because he was afraid. Abraham didn't have fear of God in his heart. He didn't trust God. And so the accusation that he throws out against Abimelech is actually an indictment on his own soul. He judged Abimelech far too soon. He didn't know what God's plans were. He didn't trust God. And he says, I thought there was no fear of God at all in this place. And because of my wife, they're going to kill me. And it says, besides, she is indeed my sister. So I didn't lie, Abraham says. He throws his arms up and is like, it wasn't untrue. She is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do to me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. I mean, right here, he's saying, don't blame Sarah for this. This is my fault. So he's taking some responsibility here, saying, I told her to do this. This was me, not her. And yet he was dead wrong on both accounts. This is all Abraham acting out of faithless fear. He's not trusting God. He's not trusting that God has a plan, that God will enrich him, that God will give him a nation and a name and a family and a son. He's just being faithless again. And it's easy to judge Abraham in this moment and to say, how could he, not listen to God? How could he not fear God? God came to him several times now and has given him the covenant and has worked with Abraham. And we can say, how, Abraham? How? And I'm going to stop to share really quick so that we can just talk for a moment. This is us a lot of the time. It's easy to rag on Abraham. It's easy to look and say, even the unrighteous man was righteous in Abimelech. The man who didn't have faith was righteous. And we can blame Abraham all we want, and yet this is us. We have the Holy Spirit of God living inside of us. We have the new covenant with Jesus. To us has been given the promises of God. To us, the church, we have Jesus. We have eternity. We have faith, and that's even a gift in and of itself. And yet, how often are we faithless? How often are we the ones that doubt God's promises? I know for me, it's quite often. And I also ascribe promises to God at times that he never promised. I ascribe to him things like comfort and wellness, when he never promised us comfort and wellness. And so I ascribe to God promises he never made, and I forget promises that he did. And because of that, I'm faithless at times. And if I'm faithless as a pastor, I know you are. Not that I'm any better than anyone else, but as Jamie says, if I struggle with this, I know someone else does. And so Abraham is us. We are Abraham. And I just want you to look inside for a moment and to think to yourself, where am I not fearing God? Where am I giving over to faithless fear? This is an easy season for us to be faithless. With coronavirus raging, heck, I had a test yesterday for coronavirus. So I'm even a bit scared of it right now, even as a young person. It's easy to be afraid of the riots that are happening, the protests around racial injustice. It's easy to be afraid and to think that the end is here and that there's no hope. And yet all of that is us not having fear of God in our hearts. That is us not trusting God. He will do good for us, that he will seek our good in his righteousness. And so I just want to give you 15 seconds to think through this of silence. I'm just going to be quiet. I'm going to put the text back up on the screen. But think of the place where you're giving into fear, faithless fear. Where are you giving into faithless fear? And then in that 15 seconds, I want you to give it back over to God. I want you to say, God, I trust you. And I give this to you because I fear you, not the world around me. Okay, so let's move on. What's interesting is that Abraham said that there's no fear of God at all in this place. And we see in Psalm 36, long after Abraham, probably of David, we see in Psalm 36, verses 1-4, it says, transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes. For he flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. He plots trouble while on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. That's the claim that Abraham is lobbing against Abimelech, that there's no fear of God before his eyes, that transgression speaks in his heart. And what's fascinating is that in verse 4, it says he plots trouble while on his bed. The wicked man, the man who has no fear of God. And yet what does Abimelech do? While he's in bed, he has a dream from Yahweh. And he repents in his bed. And he believes Yahweh and has fear of Yahweh in his bed. Instead of plotting trouble, he's acting righteously. And instead of setting himself in a way that's not good, he is setting himself in a way that is good. It is righteous. And he is rejecting evil, the evil of adultery, the evil of taking Sarah as a married woman. He sees all this. And so Abraham is lobbying this horrible accusation against Abimelech. And yet Abimelech is the opposite of Psalm 36, 1-4. Just a fascinating thing I found as I was studying this week. Now let's see what happens since Abimelech is not the unrighteous man and Abraham kind of goes back and forth. Let's see what happens in the resolution. So it says, then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you. To Sarah, he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you. And before everyone, you are vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So we have Abimelech giving the bride price for Sarah now to Abraham in reverse. Instead of giving it to him when he took Sarah, he's giving it to him as he returns Sarah, basically saying that she is being given to Abraham as his bride once again. And these oxen are this sign of innocence, right? This 1,000 pieces of silver, and these sheep and these oxen, male servants and female servants. These are all the sign of innocence in the eyes of all who are before Sarah, so that they know that she is blameless in this, and that Abraham is not blameless. Now it's fascinating, really quick here in verse 16, Abimelech says, behold, and he says this to Sarah, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. He doesn't say to your husband, he is once again indicting Abraham. He said, look, he said he's your brother. He deceived me, and so I'm going to call him your brother because that's what he used in order to deceive me. And so this is Abimelech again saying, you messed up, Abraham, and yet even though you messed up, I'm not going to do unrighteousness to you. I'm not going to be unrighteous. I'm going to do the righteous thing here because there is fear of God here. And so he's indicting Abraham as he's righting the wrong. And what we see is that Sarah, the one who has been barren, because she is taken, brought barrenness to the house of Abimelech. So all of his, so his wife and all of the wombs of the house of Abimelech were closed. And so in these, I don't know if it's a week, if it's a month, 3 months, whatever it is, the closing of the wombs of the house of Abimelech is reversed because Sarah is given back. Now, if you have my PowerPoint up, if you're following along on your computer as I talk, you can see in my notes section on this slide, I have a lot of notes about Abimelech paying the reparations to Abraham and Sarah, and like all 3 different types that he gives. I have a bunch of different quotes in here from some commentaries, but all that to say, take a look at it on your own time. But Abimelech here is being righteous and righting the wrong, and Abraham is receiving in spite of being unrighteous. And so God is keeping his promise to bless Abraham to those who bless him, because Abimelech now is blessing Abraham. And so he's blessing Abimelech through Abraham. It's fascinating to see how God is being faithful in spite of Abraham's faithlessness. All right, this is the big story. We are now at the birth of Isaac. Abimelech they've parted ways, and we're going to see him again at the end of our story today. But what's really important here is to see that we have now come to the promised moment. Abraham is 100 years old. It's been 23 years, if not more, since God visited him the first time and promised him to be a great nation. And in those 23 years, Abraham now finally receives that promise, the fruition of that promise. So chapter 21, verse 1, it says, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son, who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac, which means he laughs. Verse 4, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Everyone's shocked, which is fascinating, right? God promised this. And yet they're still surprised, which, I would be too. At 100 years old and at 99 years old, I would be surprised that God did it, even though I trusted him to do it. So what we see are a couple things here. Isaac means he laughed. And if we remember to when God promises Abraham a son, Abraham laughs and Sarah laughs. And yet Isaac is now named he laughs. It's kind of like God's getting the last laugh here, because Abraham now, whenever he says, Isaac, Isaac, he's saying he laughs, reminding himself that he laughed at God. He laughed at the promise. It's kind of this constant reminder to Abraham to trust God, that God keeps his promises. God is not unfaithful. He will always be present. And now he has this tangible reminder, this physical reminder, not just him being circumcised, being a physical reminder, but now having a son and then circumcising his son. These 2 new physical reminders of God's faithfulness. And Abraham here is righteous. He finally follows exactly what God has him do. God said on the 8th day, circumcise any young male in your family. And what does he do? he circumcises Isaac on the 8th day, just as God had commanded him. And so we see Abraham leading well, finally, in this moment. And he's 100 years old. 23 years have passed, and finally God gives what he had promised. And I love this. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. This isn't Sarah saying that she's a laughing stock. The language here is that Sarah is overjoyed at the fact that she is now a mother. She is overjoyed that God has given this promise. And so she says, God is making me laugh, now not out of skepticism, but out of the hilarity of his giving, at how crazy it is that God would give a child to a 99-year-old woman, birthing him to a 100-year-old man. So she's just laughing at God's provision in a good way, not in a mocking way, but in a good way. And she says, everyone who hears will laugh over me. Again, that doesn't mean laugh at me. It's going to be laugh with me. That's what the language is saying here. That they're all going to just join in and just be shocked. They're going to laugh at the fact that this happened, that God did this miracle. This is a bona fide miracle here. There was no chance of Abraham and Sarah getting pregnant on their own, and yet God made a way. He promised it, and he has done it, which is fascinating. All right. Continuing on. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go back just really quick. One more thing I wanted to say. Abraham already had a son, Ishmael, through Hagar. And God said that's not the son of the promise. That's not the son of the lineage. That Isaac is now the son of the promise. That through Isaac, Abraham will be made into a great nation. And it's through Isaac, we go all the way back to the promise given to Eve. Through Isaac, the Redeemer will come. The one who will crush the head of the serpent will come. And so we see this lineage now developing as God continues throughout history to bring redemption to his people and to bring Jesus into the world about 2,000 years after this, maybe 1,500 years after at this moment. But God is continuing to redeem the world around him after we fell. All right, now, verses 8 through 14, Genesis chapter 21. It says, and the child, Isaac, grew and was weaned, which this means he was probably anywhere from 2 to 3 years old at this point. The commentators kind of debate about whether it's 2 or 3, but that's the consensus. It's not, he's not 6 months, he's not a year, he's not a year and a half. He's definitely between 2 and 3 years old. And it says, after he was weaned, Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. She saw Ishmael laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out the slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. Now, I thought Sarah just said that everyone's going to laugh about this. This is going to be a great thing. This is, everyone's going to just be overjoyed at this boy. And yet, the first time we see someone laughing about Isaac, the one who laughs, by the way, he laughs, Ishmael is laughing over Isaac. And Sarah's furious. She is so upset about this. She can't contain it. And so she banishes Hagar and Ishmael. And so what does this word laughing mean? It has a couple meanings in the Hebrew. And one of the I'm going to go through 4 or 5 of the meanings, but then we're going to really interpret it through Galatians chapter 4, where Paul really interprets this for us. But the Hebrew word of verse 9 about laughing can mean it's just benign laughing. He's just kind of giggling with Isaac or at Isaac. It could be playful laughing, that they're playing together and laughing and having fun. One sense could be sexual in some sense, sexual abuse, laughing. It's a weird way to use the word, but it does occur in Scripture. Although no commentator worth their weight in salt says that that's the way it's being used. Or it could be a warring type of laughter that this word is used. It's war towards them or hate. And it's probably more that one than anything else as I look into the lexicons and dictionaries and to see what this word means. Because Paul will interpret this for us in Galatians chapter 4, verses 28 through 31. Paul says, now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. And he's talking to the church, to us, we are the children of promise. But just as at the time, he who was born according to the flesh, Ishmael, persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. So Paul goes and completely interprets this passage to understand it both in its historical context, but also as to us, the church, showing that this is a moment where we see, are the people of God, the people of promise, going to get the promises, or the people of the flesh, those who are not part of the promises, going to receive the inheritance of God? And what does it say? Paul says that Ishmael was persecuting Isaac, persecuting in this moment. Now, I don't know how you persecute a 2 or 3-year-old, but what we can tell is that this laughing is not benign. This is not playful. This is warring, W-A-R, warring, or it is persecuting laughter, or it is mocking laughter. So what we see it as most likely is mocking Isaac. What we probably see here is a scene where there's this whole party for Isaac as he's 2 or 3 years old. And Ishmael's over in the corner looking at Isaac, and he's just laughing at him, mocking, because Ishmael says, I'm the oldest son. He's not going to get anything. Ishmael's probably 13 at this point, I believe, 13 or 14. And because of that, he's saying, this is mine, not his. And he's mocking Isaac. And Sarah sees it, right? Sarah sees it. And it's in this scene that Sarah says, cast out the slave woman with her son. For the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. So it's clear that it's all about who's going to be heir. Ishmael is laughing about being heir and alongside of Isaac, or the older one who will receive 80% of the inheritance. And so what does she do? She says, no, Isaac receives the promise. He is my son. He is the son of inheritance. And so we have to throw Hagar and Ishmael out. And what we see is that this is really distressing and displeasing to Abraham. I mean, he loves Isaac. That's his son. It's his firstborn son. Even though it's not the son of promise, he's still his boy. And now Sarah, his wife, has come to him saying, get rid of him. Get rid of your boy. Get rid of your concubine. I mean, this must have been so impossible for Abraham in this moment to choose between Sarah and Isaac and Hagar and Ishmael. And yet he does choose, and he chooses Sarah and Isaac, which, as Paul says, that's what we should do. It's that God chooses his people. He chooses those of inheritance, those born according to the Spirit. So we are children, church, of the free woman. We are children of Sarah, children of the promise, born of the Spirit, not children born of the flesh, born into slavery, right? We are born of the Spirit. And so going on, we're going to see something really sad take place. And Abraham now is going to throw Hagar and Ishmael out. So, but God said to Abraham, be not displeased. God could tell, God knows everything, but he comes to Abraham and he knows that Abraham's distressed. He knows that he's so grieving this moment and displeased. But God says, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Abraham's sitting here. Which one do I choose? Do I choose Ishmael? Do I choose Isaac? Ishmael or Isaac? Which one do I go with? And God says, go with the son of promise. And he says, verse 13, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he's your offspring. And so God even tells Abraham, I will protect him. Don't worry. Don't be distressed. You keep Isaac and Sarah. They are those born through the Spirit, born through the promise. And he says, allow them to leave. I will take care of them, though. God knows what he's going to do with Ishmael. He's telling Abraham, I have promised you to be a great nation, and you will through Isaac, but you also will be a great nation through Ishmael. And he says, I'm going to take care of Ishmael and Hagar. Don't worry about them. And so what does it say? In verse 14, it says, so Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. I mean, this is a grieving moment. Abraham loads them up with as many supplies as he can. He gets them prepared for the voyage, and yet gives them over to God, and knows that his time now taking care of Ishmael and Hagar is over. He's releasing them into God's hands. I mean, have you ever had to cast something completely on God? Have you ever had to say, I can't control this situation. I can't fix the situation. I can't help whatever's going on in this moment, but God can. And so I'm going to completely entrust this situation to him. I know I'm going to stop sharing again so we can just talk. I know I've shared this before, and I'm going to keep sharing it because it's just prevalent in my mind, and I'm sure it's hitting home for some of you who have either gone through this situation or have kids or grandkids that are going through the situation. But my wife and I, again, we're going through infertility. It's been 2 years now. We've tried pretty much everything at this point. We have doctors, we've had tests, everything you can think of. And at this point, we're kind of just saying, God, I can't control this. And there's nothing I can do here. I can't make this better. I know your promises are not for kids to me. I know your promises aren't for me to get all the desires of my heart, but so that my heart looks like your heart, Father. But God, this is what my heart desires. And what's interesting is I've just had to give it over to him completely and to say, not my will, but your will be done, God, which is so difficult when thinking about starting a family and me saying, not my will, but your will be done. And that's probably only a fraction of what Abraham is going through here, because this is his son, his firstborn son, who he's lived with for 13, 14 years now, and his son's mother. And he's putting them out into the desert, not with an entourage, not with guards, not with hope, really, but just hoping that God will take care of them because God said he would. This is Abraham truly moving in faith. We saw him be faithless a lot with Abimelech and before, but then he circumcises Isaac and has Isaac, and he begins to act righteously. And it doesn't make sense that God says, cast him out, and it's going to be okay. It doesn't make sense to Abraham. He's displeased, he's distressed, and yet he trusts God. And he says, okay, God, I have open hands. Please honor your promise. Here you go. And he gives his son away to the desert, that without God's help, they would die. And he knew that. And yet God promises Abraham that he will make a great nation of Ishmael. And so we see finally Abraham being faithful and trusting God. We see him in this moment saying, I'm not going to give in to fear. I'm going to have faith. And that's the beauty of this moment, is that we see Abraham stepping into his patriarchal role in a beautiful way to be faithful for his family, faithful for his people. And this is the lineage that we come from, a faith that Abraham, even at 100 years old, is growing in his faith. I don't know about you, but that gives me hope that I'm 30. Bob's 35, I think, and I know a lot of you are a tad older than that. And yet all of us have this example on Abraham. He's a 100-year-old man. I don't think any of us are 100 years old who are a part of this class. And he was still growing. He, at 102 now, 103 now, because that's when Isaac was weaned, is becoming more and more faithful. Amazing, just amazing. So we can always grow. We can always continue on with God. And so take some hope in that. Understand that that's what God wants for us, is to grow with him, is to always be submitting our lives to him. And if Abraham can keep growing at 103 and the Holy Spirit's not even living inside of him and he's still growing, friend, we can continue growing too. We can get more and more faithful up until the very day that we die and go and see Jesus. So take some heart with that, because that's a beautiful promise that we have. Okay, back to the text, back to Genesis. Now, as Hagar and Ishmael are in Beersheba, or however you want to say it, but Beersheba, as they're wandering the desert, it says, when the water skin was gone, they've run out of supplies, they've run out of everything that will keep them alive, which means it's probably been a little while. It says, when the water skin was gone, Hagar, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, let me not look on the death of this child. Let's just stop there. Isaac, Ishmael, as a 13 or 14-year-old boy, has probably passed out at this point, or is greatly hungry and thirsty and is about to die. And he knows it, she knows it. They know that they are in dire straits, that they're at the end of their rope. And so Hagar cannot bear the sight of her son dying. And so she puts him under a bush and she goes a bow shot away. I don't know how far they were shooting bows back then, 60 yards, 100 yards, maybe less. But she's not looking at him because she's so grieved by the fact that they're about to die. So she says, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and she wept. This is the loneliest moment of Hagar's life. This woman who was a slave woman, this woman who was given to Abraham just so that she could have a kid for him. This woman who's been used and who served Sarah her whole life. This woman who never really had a true place in Abraham's family. This is her loneliest moment, which is saying something. This is the moment where she is weeping and is lifting up her voice. She's wailing because she knows she's going to die and that her son's going to die. But what happens? God steps in. It says in verse 17, and God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. So not only does God come and say, Hagar, I'm going to save you. It's going to be okay. I've heard Ishmael's cries. I've heard Ishmael's voice. Not yours. This is on the basis of your son. He is now a son of a new promise, a different promise than what Isaac has, but a promise nonetheless. And this boy, I'm going to make him to a great nation, so he will not die right now. Do not worry. So she grabs him by the hand, and they start walking, and it says, then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. So God does another miracle. He opens her eyes, and she sees a well of water. I don't know if God causes a well to be there, or if she was blinded by that fact so that God could come and show it to her, or what. We don't know exactly how it happens, but it says God opens her eyes, and she sees the well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And that is how God rescues even the outcast. He takes care of Ishmael and Hagar in this moment. And it says that God was with the boy and he grew up. That's a powerful statement. We always think of God being with his covenant people, with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, which is true. He always was. And yet he's also here taking care of Ishmael. He's with Ishmael because there's been a promise there. And it said, Ishmael lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And so he grows up. He's a skilled fighter. He's a strong man. He lives in the wilderness. And so, he's like Bear Grylls, an ultimate survivor kind of guy. And he gets married and he begins to have a family. And this promise is fulfilled that God gives, that he's going to become a great nation. And we'll see Ishmaelites later on in Genesis and later on in the Old Testament. And they're strong. They're a strong people to be reckoned with because God promised to make them, to make him a great nation. And so God does miracle after miracle here. He rescues them from certain death. He has given Ishmael a promise. He's with Ishmael his whole life. He grows him up into a strong fighter. And then we also see the same happen with Isaac, that God is with Isaac his whole life, in that God promises to Abraham this beautiful, great nation. And instead of just one, he gets two because he has two sons. God is on the move, and God is doing something powerful in these stories. Whether his people, Abraham and his family, are faithful or not, God is still moving powerfully. Now we've come to an end of the first three sections where we're rounding the bend here of our time together today, Genesis 20 and 21. And now we're going to end again with Abimelech. We're going to end with the second story of Abimelech. And he's not going to take Sarah this time, thankfully, but he's going to make a treaty with Abraham and try and consolidate some power. And the two are going to come together as friends. It says, at that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. And a truer statement couldn't have been said, because God is with Abraham all the time. Whether Abraham wants it or not, believes it or not, or trusts it or not, God is with Abraham in all that he does. And Abimelech says, now, therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity, my children and their children's children. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal kindly with me, and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. So here they're making a treaty together. And Abimelech says, look, I've been good to you, Abraham. You wronged me, and yet I blessed you. And so I'm asking for that same kindness in return. And we see that it's the commander of his army that's with him, Phicol, or Phicol, or however you say that, you choose to say that. And so what we can see is that Abimelech is probably going through consolidating power in the area. And so he comes to Abraham, who is, I wouldn't call him a warlord, but he's definitely a chieftain of sorts. And so he has a large force around him. And so Abimelech wants to make peace. And so they make this peace treaty together. And he says, look, don't ever deal falsely with me again. I know that's what you have done in the past, but promise me you won't do that again. And promise me that your children and my children will also have peace together. Now, what's fascinating is that Abimelech is king of the Philistine people. And so we know that later on, the Philistines and the Israelites are going to have a lot of conflict. And so this promise will go a long way up until there's deep conflict between Israel and the Philistines. And so it's really interesting to see generations back how they had this treaty and then how it fell apart over time as they forgot this treaty. So these are bookmarks for the narrative describing the birth of the heir, Isaac, and the expulsion of Isaac's chief rival Ishmael. So Abimelech are these bookends. And so it says, but the New American Commentary that I've been reading this says, by enveloping these two critical accounts with the Abimelech incidents, the author accomplishes theological and literary advantages. Theological and literary advantages. What we see is that Abraham was faithless, faithful, and now can rectify what he did in the past. And he's able to make right the wrongs that happened in the past, which is a beautiful thing. And so we're going to end our time today, these two more passages together, where they continue to make this treaty. And it says, when Abraham reproved, or when he went and he talked with Abimelech and accused Abimelech of his people, he says, when Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this thing. You didn't tell me, and I've not heard of it until today. So Abraham was accusing Abimelech of taking this well before he agrees really to a true treaty. He says, look, I'm going to deal well with you, but I need you to know about the actual well that your people stole from me. And Abimelech says, look, man, I don't know anything about that. That was my servants, those were my guys, and I'm going to right that wrong. And so Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech. And the two men made a covenant, not just a treaty, but a covenant now. And what we know about covenants is that these two sheep and oxen would have been split in half, and the two men would have walked between the four animals. And as they walked between them, what they were saying with their motion, with their actions, was, if I break the covenant on my end, let me become like these animals. Let me become undone, rent in half. Let me die if I break this covenant. And so that's how serious they are in this moment. It's not just a treaty between kings. This is a covenant between two men, two leaders of two peoples. And they made a covenant. And Abraham sent 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. He set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? And he said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. So just like Abimelech sends servants and 1,000 silver shekels and livestock, he sends all of these things to Abraham to say, Sarah, I've done no wrong here. She's yours, all of that. Now Abraham's saying, I'm setting apart 7 lambs so that you know this is my well. So we can both say together, this is the well. He's giving a bride price, if you will, or he's buying the well with goodwill. And so Abraham here is saying, this is mine, you know it, I know it now, and we're going to declare that in this moment. So what's fascinating is that this is the very first piece of land that God's people own, that it is declared as theirs. Now, God has declared that he's going to give them the promised land, and that will come in due time. But this well, this area at Beersheba, becomes Abraham's. And the promise of land begins to be fulfilled. The promise that God says, I will give you land and make you a great nation, are both being fulfilled in these passages. We have Isaac being born, the great nation that will come from him. And then we now have Beersheba, this well, this land that God is giving Abraham. And so God's making his promises come true. And it says, therefore the place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. And what's interesting is that Beersheba means either one of two things. It means the well of 7 or the well of oath. It's the same word. It can mean 2 different things. But what's interesting is that it's a play on words. It means the well of oath and the well of 7. I've given you 7 lambs, and we've sworn an oath here that this belongs to Abraham. It's interesting, right? It's just how even the words that they use to call it, it's the well of 7, the well of the oath. And so they made a covenant at Beersheba in verse 32. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. And that brings us to the conclusion of our passages today. I'm going to read a short passage from the commentary, the New American Commentary on Genesis, and it says, thus it is significant that at Beersheba, Abraham worshiped the Lord and called on him as God everlasting. an acknowledgement not only of God's eternal nature, but also of the enduring character of his promises, which Abraham had now begun to experience firsthand. Um, he is praising God at Beersheba. He plants a tree for posterity. Trees, when you plant a tree, there are so many different motifs and themes about trees in the Bible. Tree of life, tree of knowledge, good and evil. There's other, Jesus is hung on a tree. And yet here we see a tree being planted, which is a tree of hope. It's going to grow. And this is Abraham kind of planting his flag in the area, saying, this is my land, the land that God has given me. And it says he calls there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God at Beersheba. Powerful, powerful moments here that we see in Genesis 20 and 21. So let's wrap it up. We know that Abraham is a deeply flawed man, that this man of faith is actually a lot of the time a man of faithlessness. And yet the older he gets, the more faithful he becomes. And it's great to see that even at 103, Abraham's learning new things about God, learning to trust him more, learning to be more like him. Usually the other characters we meet are more faithful than Abraham. Abimelech is righteous in what he does. And what we see is that God, his promise to Abraham is based on divine election, not on Abraham's faithfulness. If it's based on Abraham's faithfulness, there would be no promise anymore because Abraham was not faithful for many, many years. And yet God said, this is my promise to my man, and I'm going to fulfill it. We see that Isaac is born, and he is the son of promise, where Jesus will come from many generations later. And we see that Hagar and Ishmael are provided for and given a new promise as well. And then we end with the land being owned now by Abraham. And we see overall that the promises of God, the promises of land and a nation are both being fulfilled in chapters 20 and 21. And that's why they're so important for us to understand, because God always keeps his promises. He's never one to go back on his promises. He is faithful as the day is long. So you can trust that. Next week, we're going to have Abraham, Isaac, and faith. It's the crazy story where God comes to Abraham and asks him to sacrifice his son. And it's going to be riveting. Pastor Bob's going to go through that. And you can always email us at rgoble, G-O-B-L-E, or bdrew, D-R-E-W, at scottsdalebible.com. If you have questions, comments, concerns, we love getting anything from you guys. But it's been an honor to get to go through Genesis 20 and 21 with you guys today. I appreciate you giving me some grace on the timing of all of this, as I have been sick all week. Please pray for me and my wife and my family, and I'm praying for you guys consistently. If you have questions, shoot them in as an email. If you have comments, if you have prayer requests, I'd love to pray for you by name and specifically. But guys, we love you, and we'll see you next week. All right. God bless you all.